Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and I'm stretched a little thin these days. Work is very overwhelming. I'm working under a major deadline right now. I'm not sleeping great. I am drinking a lot more caffeine than I usually do in order to try to keep myself on track and awake with work. I'm overwhelmed. But we are going to talk about witchcraft today because that is what we do. And in particular, we're going to talk about the intersection of witchcraft and astrology, which I think is a really interesting sort of confluence of two different parts of the occult world. Because most astrologers are not witches, and honestly, most of the witches I know, excepting that I don't know all of the witches in the world and don't speak for the totality of the witchcraft population, most of the witches I know don't really like astrology and don't really put much stock in astrology. And I think that's really interesting. So I want to talk a little bit about the relationship that witchcraft and astrology might have, the relationship that they do have, and the relationship that they often don't have, and sort of tease some of those things apart. For starters, I think we need to get a little clear about what we mean when we say astrology, because astrology is a very wide field, and it can mean a lot of different things. So today I want to think about four main types of astrology. The first, and probably the most familiar to all of us, is natal chart astrology. So this is astrology that looks at the arrangement of heavenly bodies at a particular time and place, usually the time and place of a person's birth, and using that arrangement to provide insight into the life of the person who was born. And this can be heavily psychological. So sometimes it will be making commentary about your character. You know, you have Venus in Aries, so you tend to make rash and impulsive decisions in your love life, things like that. Or it can also be a little bit more external. It can be a little bit more about making concrete predictions about events and happenings in the life of a person rather than just sort of describing their personality. So, for example, if someone has the ruler of their 10th house in their 7th house, they might get into their career because a romantic partner sort of helps them find a job opportunity. And that would be an example of a more specific kind of prediction that is made in natal chart astrology that is not so psychological. It's not about like, oh, your personality is like this, but it's more concrete and directed at, here are events that will happen in your life, here are the ways that they will happen. Also, I should preface this before I go any further in the video by saying I'm not an astrologer. I'm competent at astrology in most rooms. I am the person in the room who knows most about astrology because most people don't know anything about it. But I am not in any way an experienced or expert astrologer. So all of the examples I throw out, these are examples off the top of my head. They're probably going to be flawed, right? I'm just sort of working from a baseline of astrological knowledge here, and I'm not trying to claim any kind of expertise. So if I get delineations wrong or anything like that, please understand I'm just throwing examples out here. I'm not trying to be terribly sophisticated because I don't have that kind of expertise. But so that's one kind of astrology. Second kind of astrology is electional astrology. So this is trying to use astrological configurations to choose a particular time to begin an enterprise, an auspicious time to start an undertaking. And that could be a business project, that could be a date or a romantic endeavor, that could be any kind of thing that you want to start, any kind of event that you want to organize. The idea behind electional astrology is that you look at the configuration of the planets and you find a configuration that is particularly auspicious or particularly harmonious, where the things going on in the heavens sort of correlate to the kind of energy that you want to bring into this new endeavor that you're starting. And the idea is you're sort of getting started on the right foot. You're kicking off at a time and a place where sort of the tides of the universe are flowing in the same direction that you want to go. So you're taking advantage of astrological energy to make life easier for you by doing a thing that's sort of in tune with what the universe is doing anyway. Type number 3 of astrology is orrery astrology. This is the kind of astrology that's used for straight up divination. You ask a question, you cast an astrological chart at that particular time, and then you interpret the chart to provide an answer to your question. Orrery astrology is particularly useful, I find, for locating lost objects. I'm not very good at orrery astrology. I'm so-so with it, but I've done it a couple of times before and had success with it. And it's honestly kind of refreshing to have a form of divination that is very specific and concrete and says, like, no, this is, you know, your lost car keys are on the kitchen table or whatever. As opposed to, you know, if you try to use tarot to find your lost car keys, we'll be like, well, I think you should look within yourself and evaluate your relationship to authority. And have you considered the role of domesticity in the location of where your car keys might be, and how that might relate to your inner journey of like, tarot is, I love tarot. Tarot is incredibly valuable as a divination tool, but tarot is very narrative. Tarot is very symbolic and thematic and abstract. And it's not as good for the concrete, straightforward questions like, where are my keys? So, and then the fourth type of astrology is magical astrology. So using astrological energies, and particularly the energies of particular planets, to raise power for a particular magical goal. And this could be through the doctrine of signatures. So if you wanted to use particular herbs that are associated with Mars in order to bring the energy of Mars into, you know, if you're making a spell bag or whatever, or if you're making a tincture or some kind of herbalism thing, or likewise, if you wanted to, you know, if you're making a love talisman and you wanted to use the seal of Venus on your love talisman to bring the planetary energy of Venus into it. And there are various types of ways to do astrological magic. Some of them are just the sorts of things I've mentioned. Some of them get sort of increasingly complicated. So there are Solomonic pentacles associated with each of the 7 planets. And there's a particular procedure for making those pentacles where you make them in the day and hour of Mercury, on a day when the moon is waxing in an airy or earthy sign. Like, you know, there's a set of constraints. And then ranging all the way up to Picatrix style magic, which is super cool, very effective, and also extraordinarily complicated and sometimes just too much work, because you basically do complex electional astrology for the creation of a magical talisman, and there's a whole thing. Very, very interesting stuff. But anyway, so those are sort of, broadly speaking, 4 different types of things that people mean when they say astrology. These are not the only types of things that astrology can be. Astrology has other applications as well, but these are sort of the 4 really big ones that I've encountered in being around the astrological community. And I find that a lot of Wiccans, when they say they don't believe in astrology, more often than not, they're talking about that first type of astrology. They're talking about natal chart astrology. And in particular, they tend to be talking about the psychological version of natal chart astrology. So a lot of people really rebel against the idea that, you know, I am who I am, not because I have made particular choices in my life or because I've been shaped by societal and material influences in my life, but because Venus was in a particular sign in the zodiac at the time that I was born. And I understand why people rebel against that. I do. Personally, I put stock in astrology. I put stock in all 4 types of astrology. That is not to say that I think that everyone should. My attitude to astrology is very similar to my attitude to most things magical, which is that I have had sufficient experiences with astrology where I have felt that I've gotten enough evidence for it to satisfy my own mind, to allay my own doubts. I've had enough direct experience to convince myself, you know, and therefore I believe in it, but I don't believe that my experiences should be the basis of anyone else's believing in it, right? So the same way that, like, I believe in magic because I have had enough of a track record of success with magical operations to allay my own doubts. Therefore, I believe in it, but I don't necessarily believe that my experiences are enough evidence for other people to believe in magic. I think that they only count as good evidence for me. I have similar feelings about astrology. If you don't believe in astrology, if you don't put stock in it, if you feel that you have not seen evidence of it working and you're not into it, no skin off my back, right? And I think that's where a lot of witches tend to be with astrology, is they're just not that into it, and they haven't, for their own, whatever their threshold of evidence is, they haven't seen enough of it. They're skeptical about how it might work, and they're not going to put stock in it, and that's okay. But it's interesting to me that a lot of the witchcraft community, which is so woo and so into magic, tends to balk at this particular thing. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the reasons that witches maybe aren't into astrology, and some of the ways that astrology can be brought into witchcraft for it to be sort of more palatable, for it to blend. Because I think one thing is astrology and witchcraft just have very different flavors. Witchcraft tends to be very low magic, right? Tends to be rooted quite a bit in folk magic, tends to be about claiming power in a subversive way. This is my extraordinarily broad definition of witchcraft. I try not to be too specific about defining witchcraft because I get into trouble with trying to define such a nebulous word, but I think that broadly speaking, witches claim magical power in a subversive way, right? As opposed to sort of regular folk magic, which might not be terribly subversive, or other ways of claiming power that are subversive but not magical. So, right, political rebellion is not in and of itself witchcraft. Witches may use their magic for political rebellion, but you get the idea. But I think that witchcraft tends to be very low magic and tends to be very sort of experiential and earthy, right? So witches like the kind of magic that they can see and touch, like the kind of magic that doesn't require calculations or, particular abstractions, right? Witches like magic that is simple and straightforward and easy to perform. It doesn't require a lot of supplies, doesn't require elaborate tools or particular magical timings or anything like that. Witches like, oh, it's a waxing moon, I'm going to do a spell to increase wealth, and, I'm going to take some basil and make an oil out of it, and I'm going to anoint my door frame. Boom, we're done. And astrological magic tends not to be that. It tends to be very thinky, very up in your head. It requires a lot of calculation. Not just astrological magic, but astrology in general is about sort of the movement of heavenly bodies that most of us can't identify right away. Like most of us, even if you can look up into the sky and be like, oh, there's Venus, most of us can't be like, oh, there's Venus, and Venus is in Capricorn, and Venus is trine Jupiter, which is in, Taurus, and so on. Astrology requires an ephemeris, astrology requires tools and making charts, and it doesn't feel witchy. It doesn't feel like the kind of very straightforward, simple, let's get results sort of magic that a lot of witches like to do. And similarly, astrological magic tends to be a little bit more abstract, right? Witchcraft is, I need to sell my house, I'm going to use some, High John the Conqueror oil to make my house more appealing to potential buyers. And astrology is, I want to bring abundance into my life, and so I'm going to do a Jupiter pentacle, and da-da-da-da-da. It's a little more conceptual, it's a little more abstract, it's a little bit less sort of directed towards specific concrete results. If you're trying to sell a house, if you need to sell your house within the next 12 days, you're not going to make a Picatrix-style talisman, because in order to find the proper election for a Picatrix-style talisman, it's probably going to take up to a year to find something that's really good. Possibly even more than a year, right? And so I think that's one thing, is that witches just aren't in that kind of intellectual space, aren't in that abstract space, are in a much more concrete, down-to-earth style of occultism and magic and interacting with the world. And, witches do like to put ourselves in tune with certain natural cycles, right? Most witches I know follow the cycles of the moon, at least in some capacity, right? You may not be a devout, moon cycle tracker, whatever. You may not cast every spell based upon the phase of the moon, but most witches I know at least pay attention to the phases of the moon. at least sort of have that going in the back of their mind. Wiccans follow the cycles of the sun in the wheel of the year. And actually, Patricia Crowther is a very, very staunch supporter of astrology in its relationship to witchcraft. And in all of her books, she talks about bringing astrology into witchcraft. So in Coven Sense, she talks about the mansions of the moon and using those for magical purposes in a Wiccan context. In Lid Off the Cauldron, she talks about the sort of zodiacal nature of the wheel of the year, right? Because the solstices and the equinoxes are astrologically defined. They're the points of the sun's ingress into each of the four cardinal signs. And she actually, Patricia Crowther, argues that the four greater Sabbats, so Beltane, Lammas, Samhain, and Candlemas, ought to be astrologically defined as well. So most of us celebrate them on the first day of month, so the 1st of May, the 1st of August, the 1st of November, and the 1st of February. But those points are astrologically shifted, so they're not quite halfway between the solstices and equinoxes. They're a little bit earlier. And Patricia Crowther argues that we should be celebrating those Sabbats at the halfway point. So when the sun is 15 degrees into each of the fixed signs. So at 15 degrees Taurus, 15 degrees Leo, 15 degrees Scorpio, 15 degrees Aquarius. And she argues that if you think about the Julian calendar, which predates the Gregorian calendar we currently use, the 1st of May would have been when the sun was at 15 degrees Taurus. And that when the Gregorian calendar was adopted, that day got moved back. And so people are now celebrating Beltane on a day that is astrologically prior to when it should be. So Patricia Crowther is very much in favor of celebrating all of the Wheel of the Year in an astrological way, and of witches putting themselves in tune with the tides of not just of the Earth, but of celestial bodies like the moon, the sun, and even the other planets. Lid Off the Cauldron includes 7 planetary rituals that she recommends for Wiccans to perform. Most of the Wiccan covens I know don't do that. Most of the Wiccan covens I know are going to celebrate Beltane on May 1st in the Gregorian calendar, and not in the Julian calendar when it would align more with the astrological cycle. But there's sort of an argument to be made. And this connects into a broader thing, which is, I think that witches do in general want to put ourselves in tune with the tides of nature in various sorts of ways. If you're doing magic, you're drawing on sort of the energy of the natural world around you, particularly if you're doing witchcraft. Witchcraft tends to be more rooted in nature, more rooted in nature, and particularly in sort of sympathetic magic, as opposed to sort of the commanding and evocation of spirits, which is a very different sort of magic. It tends to be a little bit more ceremonial. That's leaving the question of animism out of the situation, but we only have so much time here. Witches like to put ourselves in tune with the cycles of nature because you're drawing on the natural world to raise power for your spell. And you may as well not be swimming against the current, which is why, right, if you're doing a wealth spell, you want to do it ideally on a waxing moon rather than a waning moon, because the waxing moon is a time of increase. And in that sense, it's not actually that foreign to incorporate astrology into your work. There are 7, or depending on how your astrology goes, maybe 10 planets that each have their own cycles in the natural world. And we can draw on those cycles just as easily as we draw on the cycles of the seasons or the cycles of the waxing and waning moon. So that magic is available to us and is not actually all that antithetical to the way that witches already work. But that magic can become overcomplicated very, very quickly. And witches tend to like things to be simple. So, right, the mansions of the moon are another form of lunar cycle that's a little bit more astrological than just is the moon waxing or full or waning. And you can use those in your magic, right? Patricia Crowther, once again, suggests using the mansions of the moon in Wiccan observance. But that can also become very quickly restrictive and overcomplicated, and you're like, I want to cast a love spell, but the moon is in the 9th mansion, and I really need it to be in the 6th mansion in order for me to do this. And witches tend to want to simplify and find sort of rhythms of nature that are easier to connect to and easier to bring into their magical practice. I do know a lot of witches who will do some amount of planetary magic, even if it's just planetary meditation. but a lot of witches tend to be averse to the really sort of complicated types of astrological magic. That said, having done a little bit of that magic, it's really interesting, it's really powerful, it works, and it's very much this witchcrafty sort of mindset of I'm going to sort of put myself in tune with the natural rhythms that are happening elsewhere in the world and in the cosmos in order to facilitate accomplishing this goal. I think that is something that is very much in line with the way that witches approach their magic, even though on the surface it looks like a very different sort of thing. And, you know, in a sense, all witches are planetary magicians. We're just specialists, right? I don't know a single witch who hasn't at some point in their life done a spell that took the moon into account, whether it was the phase of the moon or the mansion of the moon or the aspects between the moon and other planets or whatever, right? Like most of us do the very simple stuff. The moon is full, yada, yada, yada. But all of us, at least every witch I have ever encountered, there may be others out there who haven't, but you know, every witch I have ever encountered has at some point in time thought about the moon in relation to their magic. And most of the witches I know do that consistently. So the idea of celestial bodies and the cosmos as being relevant to our magic honestly is not that far off from what witches already do. It's just a bigger and more elaborate system. And I would encourage witches to try a little bit of it. You know, you don't have to do a lot. You don't have to go overboard with it. You don't have to do the whole elaborate Picatrix style thing, although honestly finding a Picatrix election is super fun. It's like solving a puzzle. You're like, you know, I found this, and like the correct planet is ascending, and it is on the day and the time, but it's not aspecting the moon, so I have to move it forward a week. It's great. Love that shit. Anyway, you know, try it. Try bringing astrology in. That said, I don't use a lot of astrology in my general witchcraft practice, because as a witch, I like to simplify. I like my witchcraft to be simple and grounded and straightforward. I will occasionally do it, particularly for something that's not urgent, particularly for something that's more abstract or more conceptual in nature. But, you know, the most recent spell I cast didn't have a single astrological consideration about it. The spell before that I cast didn't have a single astrological consideration about it. I think a lot of witchcraft is just you do the magic when it needs to be done, in a way that it needs to be done. And a lot of the time, the most straightforward way to do that doesn't involve astrology, which is why I think a lot of witches don't incorporate astrology into their practice. For me, in my general experience of Wicca, I find that my understanding of Wicca is not astrological. My understanding of the wheel of the year, of the cycles of the moon, of sort of the relationship that I have with my gods, none of that is astrological for me. But I think that astrology is this whole interesting and sophisticated other system that can at times overlay in a really compatible way with what I do as a witch. So I'm going to leave that off there. There's probably more that could be said, but we've been going for more than 20 minutes. So we're going to stop here. Thank you so much for watching. I have to go back to work now. Bye.